Have you ever wondered what it was like for the soldier on the other side? Not the hero, not the liberator, but the man in the concrete bunker, staring out at the sea, believing he stood behind an impenetrable wall. You think you know the story of D-Day. But what if everything you were told about German strength was a lie? For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter of the 352nd Artillery Regiment, the morning of June 6, 1944, began with a chilling revelation that shattered his world. In the next 15 minutes, you will not just hear about the Battle of Normandy. You will step inside his bunker and experience the psychological collapse of a man and an army as they confronted a force that defied logic. And in the final moments of this story, I will reveal the one critical mistake in German High Command's thinking that guaranteed their defeat before a single shot was even fired. This isn't another documentary listing dates and troop movements. This is a journey into the mind of the defender, a deep dive into the clash between propaganda and reality. By the end of this video, you will understand that D-Day wasn't won by tactics alone. It was won by something far larger, far more terrifying, and far more inevitable. Let's begin. The dawn of June 6th broke over the Normandy coast wrapped in a shroud of gray mist. The air, cold and damp, carried the familiar scent of salt and wet earth, muffling the world in a deceptive stillness. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, a veteran of the brutal Eastern Front, it was just after 5 a.m. Another watch, another day of anxious, monotonous waiting. He was 32, old enough to remember a Germany before the war, yet young enough to have been forged in its furnace. He was a professional, pragmatic, and deeply bone-achingly tired. From his observation post, a concrete bunker sunk into a high bluff, he had a commanding view of the English Channel. Through his powerful Zeiss binoculars, as the first hint of light tried to pierce the horizon, he saw the sea begin to change. It wasn't the tide. It wasn't a weather front. It was something impossible. A dark line had appeared where the sea met the sky, a smudge that refused to dissipate, instead growing, sharpening, and multiplying before his very eyes. This wasn't a fleet. It was a city of steel, a floating metropolis sailing directly out of the mist and into history. In that single, horrifying moment, before a single Allied soldier set foot on the sands below, before the world even knew the names Omaha or Utah, Klaus Richter knew with absolute certainty: the Reich was about to drown. To understand the sheer paralyzing shock of that morning, you have to understand the mindset of Fortress Europe. From the frozen coast of Norway down to the Spanish border, German engineers had constructed the Atlantic Wall. In the minds of the High Command in Berlin and in the propaganda fed to the soldiers, it was an impenetrable chain of concrete and steel, bristling with artillery, a testament to the Reich's enduring power. But Richter, the professional soldier, knew the vast difference between propaganda and reality. His command was an artillery battery, its Czech-made cannons nestled in concrete casements a few miles inland from the beach the Allies would soon christen Omaha. Day after day, he and his men drilled, calculated firing solutions, and stared out at the gray, empty water. The talk was always of Der Tag X, the day of days, the invasion. But the question was always where. German intelligence was utterly convinced the main attack would come at the Pas de Calais, the shortest point across the Channel. It was the logical choice. It was where the mighty 15th Army, the bulk of Germany's strength in the West, lay in wait. Normandy was considered a sideshow, perhaps a target for a diversionary raid, but never the main event. This catastrophic miscalculation was no accident. It was the crowning achievement of a brilliant Allied deception campaign named Operation Fortitude, a phantom army of inflatable tanks and fake radio traffic that had convinced Berlin to look the wrong way, and had left the defenders of Normandy dangerously, fatally exposed. Richter's unit, the 352nd Infantry Division, was better trained than most in the area, but it was a mere shadow of the elite forces that had conquered France 4 years earlier. It was a motley collection of battle-hardened veterans from the East, like himself, diluted by a far larger number of teenage conscripts and older reservists. They were brave, but they were not the stormtroopers of 1940. They were simply defenders, tasked with holding a line that was stretched impossibly thin. The Atlantic Wall itself was more of a patchwork than a solid barrier. Richter knew this. He had seen the incomplete bunkers, the gaps in the minefields, the blind spots in the fields of fire that local farmers still used. He harbored a professional skepticism about their chances against a truly determined assault. In the weeks leading up to June, the tension had become a living thing. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with shoring up the defenses, had been a whirlwind of activity. He ordered millions of mines and thousands of jagged steel obstacles. The men called them Rommel's asparagus, placed on the beaches. Rommel understood a terrifying truth that the High Command seemed to ignore. If the Allies weren't defeated on the beaches in the first 24 hours, the war in the West would be lost. Allied air power would shred any German reinforcements trying to move to the coast. The first day was the only day that mattered. But then, on June 5th, the weather turned. A storm blew in, churning the channel into a violent rage. The German Meteorological Office confidently predicted an invasion would be impossible for days. This forecast was the critical mistake that sealed their fate. It allowed senior officers to relax. It was why Rommel himself wasn't even in France. He had gone home to Germany for his wife's birthday. The storm, they believed, would keep them safe. So as Richter stood watch in the pre-dawn chill, the mood was routine. The storm had passed, but the sea was still choppy. No one expected a thing. He raised his binoculars again, sweeping them left and right. His heart, which had been beating in the slow, steady rhythm of a night watch, began to hammer against his ribs. Everywhere he looked, it was the same. The sea was no longer gray water. It was a solid mass of dark, menacing shapes. For a long moment, he simply could not process the scale of it. It was an insult to logic. German intelligence had estimated the Allies might muster 3,000 vessels. What he was looking at was something else entirely. He tried to count, a fool's errand. His brain, on instinct, began to categorize. The hulking silhouettes of battleships and cruisers, swarms of smaller, faster destroyers circling them like wolves. And then the others, the endless, uncountable others, landing craft of all shapes and sizes, packed so densely they looked like iron filings drawn to a colossal magnet. The official number would later be confirmed at nearly 7,000 vessels, an armada from 8 different nations. It remains the largest amphibious invasion force in human history. But to Klaus Richter, it wasn't a statistic. It was a physical presence that seemed to bend the very horizon. It was a declaration of industrial power so immense that it rendered everything he had ever known about warfare obsolete. Germany had built a wall of concrete. The Allies had responded by building a bridge of steel. He grabbed the field telephone, his hand slick with sweat. "This is Richter at Observation Post 4. I have a visual on the channel. There are ships." The voice on the other end was tired, dismissive. "We have reports of a few ships, Oberleutnant. A possible raid. Stand by." "No." Richter's voice was strained, urgent. "You don't understand. It's not a few ships. It is thousands. The entire sea is covered from horizon to horizon. This is it. This is the invasion." There was a pause. Disbelief. "Oberleutnant, the sea conditions are not suitable. Our reports show—" "Your reports are wrong!" Richter shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of terror and frustration. "I am looking at it with my own eyes. For God's sake, look at the sea." He slammed the phone down. It was too big to be believed. He tried another line to regimental headquarters, his voice now a desperate plea. "Richter here, sir. The invasion fleet is here. 10,000 ships." He knew he was exaggerating, but in that moment it felt like an understatement. The Major's voice was skeptical. "Richter, are you certain? The weather? The weather is clear enough to see the end of the world, Major, and it is sitting in the English Channel, requesting permission to open fire." This time, the urgency cut through, but the chain of command was paralyzed by a catastrophic failure of imagination. Their plans, their maps, their intelligence reports, all of it was being erased by the impossible reality floating just a few miles away. Richter didn't wait. He shouted orders to his men. Roused by the commotion, they stared out from their positions. their faces a mask of awe and terror. The drills were over. The giant barrels of the cannons, silent for so long, elevated slowly, pointing their noses toward the impossible fleet. The order finally came just before 6 a.m. Engage at will. For Richter, it was a release. The paralysis of disbelief was broken by the familiar clarity of action. "Fire!" he roared into the telephone. A moment later, the ground trembled as the first gun fired, then a second and a third. The shells screamed out over the water. Through his binoculars, Richter saw plumes of water erupt amidst the fleet. A miss, then another. His men were good. They adjusted their aim, and for a brief, glorious moment, they made their mark. He saw a direct hit on an American destroyer, the USS Corey. A flash of orange, a puff of black smoke. A cheer went up from his men. For a few minutes, it felt like a real battle. It felt like their training mattered. But the feeling was fleeting, because after the Corey was hit, the fleet did not scatter. It didn't even slow down. The gap in the formation was simply filled. The endless lines of ships kept coming, an iron tide that could not be stopped. His guns fired again and again, but for every one ship they might harass, 100 sailed past untouched. A profound sense of futility washed over him. He was a man with a bucket trying to empty the ocean. Then came the reply. It started as a low rumble from across the water. He saw flashes of light from the big ships, like a silent lightning storm on the horizon. A few seconds later, the air around him began to tear itself apart. The ground heaved. Geysers of earth erupted from the fields as shells from battleships like the USS Texas, with their massive 14-inch guns, began the systematic industrial process of dismantling the Atlantic Wall. Where was the German response? Where were the panzers? Where was the Luftwaffe? Richter scanned the skies and saw nothing but Allied planes. Fighters, bombers, transports. They owned the air completely. It was in that moment, with his own guns firing and the sky raining steel, that Richter understood the horrifying truth. This wasn't a fight. It was an extermination. The Allies weren't trying to outmaneuver him. They were trying to erase him. This single personal realization of overwhelming force is the secret that defined the entire Normandy campaign. The story of how industrial might eclipsed battlefield tactics. As the naval bombardment intensified, something in Richter's mind shifted. The tactical part of his brain, the part trained to calculate angles and range, shut down. It was replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. He was no longer seeing ships and soldiers. He was seeing the system behind them. Through his trembling binoculars, he looked past the warships and saw, in his mind's eye, the assembly lines of Detroit. He pictured factories churning out trucks, tanks, and engines on a scale Germany could only dream of. The logistics of this invasion weren't a miracle. They were a simple result of that industrial output. On D-Day, the Luftwaffe flew maybe 300 sorties in all of France. The Allies flew over 14,000. For every one German plane in the sky, there were more than 40 Allied ones. The reason wasn't a failure of German courage. It was a failure of German factories. He thought of the tanks. He knew the fearsome reputation of the German panzers. The Tiger and the Panther were technologically superior, machines of terror for Allied crews. But that superiority was a strategic dead end. They were complex, expensive, and agonizingly slow to produce. For every fearsome Tiger tank that rolled off the line, the Allies were stamping out dozens of simpler but brutally effective Sherman tanks. This was the new reality. This was the industrial equation of defeat. All the Nazi propaganda about willpower and ideological strength dissolved in the face of these cold, hard numbers. Ideology couldn't stop a bomber. Willpower couldn't sink a battleship. Richter felt a profound, almost spiritual despair. He and his men were good soldiers. They were about to die. Not because they were outfought, but because they were outnumbered on a scale that defied comprehension. They were participants in a contest that was already over. He, his men, the entire German army in the West, were like a finely crafted sword facing a steam-powered drop hammer. The outcome was never in doubt. He thought of the posters back home promising final victory. It was all a lie. Not just a political lie, but a mathematical one. The German High Command must have known. They must have seen the production charts. Yet they had sent him, and millions like him, to fight a war they could not possibly win. As the sun climbed higher, the theoretical became a brutal reality. The naval bombardment reached a crescendo, a constant rolling thunder that never ceased. The concrete of the bunker shuddered, dust raining from the ceiling. Through the observation slit, Richter saw the first waves of Higgins boats hit the shore, dropping their ramps and disgorging American soldiers into the surf. The machine guns in the German pillboxes along Omaha Beach began to chatter, tearing into the ranks of the first men. The water turned red. For a moment it seemed the defense was holding. But then, the industrial equation asserted itself again. Allied destroyers, seeing the slaughter, did something suicidal and heroic. They steamed directly towards the shore, some closing to within 1,000 yards, scraping their hulls on sandbars to turn their guns on the German bunkers. At the same time, strange new machines began to appear. Amphibious trucks driving out of the ocean, tanks crawling ashore equipped with giant flails to detonate mines. The Germans had nothing like them. The scene on the beach below turned from a struggle into a methodical process of annihilation. Richter's own battery was now a prime target. A direct hit on one of the gun pits sent a fireball into the air. His telephone lines went dead. He was isolated. He looked up at the sky one last time. It was a moving ceiling of Allied aircraft. On the sea, the first wave of landing craft was being replaced by a second and a third. Beyond them, the vast armada waited patiently, a conveyor belt of men and material that could, it seemed, run forever. The battle for the beach was still raging, but the outcome had been decided hours ago. It was just a matter of time and tonnage. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, and for the thousands of German soldiers who survived that first day, the rest of the war was just an epilogue. They fought on, driven by duty or by fear, but the hope of victory was gone. It had vanished in the gray dawn light of June 6th. We often picture the end of the Third Reich as a slow collapse, but for the men on the Atlantic Wall, the end came in a single horrifying moment of revelation. The moment they saw a fleet that filled the horizon, a sky black with enemy planes, and the full crushing weight of the modern industrial world. It was the morning they knew it was over.